What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the FCL podcast. We have a great discussion on tap for you today. We had a headliner weekend with the ACC Ivy doubleheader and Maryland Notre Dame. Clemson is hot on the women's side with a couple big road ACC wins. I'm joined by my co-hosts Stephen Rehfuss and Matt Dunn. Matt, I'm going to pass it off to you to introduce our segments for today.
Awesome. Thanks, Deemer. We have an exciting slate of segments today. We'll kick it off as normal with Stephen Rehfuss leading us through the 2-minute drill. Then we'll get into our players' perspective, where we're going to talk about some recruiting advice for uncommitted 26s right now and 27s going into the recruiting summer for both guys and girls. Then we'll get into our GPUs, our games, players, and units, then get into hot topics, anything going on in the lacrosse space that we want to talk about, and into some trends where we get into some deeper topical trends from a coaching lens, looking at the college game and the game we're seeing today. And lastly, we will look ahead into some big performances this upcoming weekend. So that's the slate for today. With that, Stephen, want to kick us off with the 2-minute drill?
Yeah, big weekend for college lacrosse last weekend. Taking a look at this ACC Ivy matchup. Princeton exits the weekend 2-0. Penn exits the weekend 0-2. Friday night, UNC beat Penn 16-8, and Princeton beat Duke in a great game 15-14. And then Sunday, Princeton with another win 14-12 over UNC, and then Duke beating Penn 11-6. Number one versus number two was as advertised. Maryland with a big win there, 11-10 over Notre Dame. Three other games that stood out to us: Penn State 15, Yale 9. Penn State continues to impress. Their only loss is a 1-goal overtime loss to Princeton. And then Hopkins UVA, that was a 13-12 win for Hopkins. They continue to win these close games. And then Colgate really stood out, an 18-6 win over Loyola. Loyola is 0-5, but I think they're better than their record shows, having only fallen to Maryland by 1. So a big win there for Colgate. On the women's side, Duke beating Notre Dame 11-9. I believe that was on Friday night. Three other games that stood out: Michigan 15, Penn 8. Clemson with a big win over Syracuse on the road, 9-8. And then JMU Florida 17-16. So notable performances. Attacking this in a little bit of a different way this week. Brady Wambach, the Fogo for UNC, he really stood out. 75% against Penn, 70% against Princeton. Chad Palumbo, he was 4-1 on Sunday against UNC after a slow start to his season. Nice to see him, looking like last year's form a little bit. Matt Lacombe, 16 saves versus Loyola for Colgate. Sam Kane, who we had on the podcast last week, 7 goals, 2 assists versus Marquette in a 2016 win. Jack Fracone, 18 saves versus Yale for Penn State. That's 67%. Continuing with the goalie lens, Logan McNaney really stood out for Maryland, especially in that fourth quarter. He had 16 saves against Notre Dame and was 62%. One more Fogo that stands out: Will Lynch, 73% for Notre Dame against Maryland. And then on the women's side, Franny Hahn, 10 points for Florida versus JMU.
I feel like we've been highlighting goalies a lot this year. Is it always early in the season that goalies are having these 70+% games? I feel like every week we're looking at these guys and there's like a 75, 80% save rate on these goalies, and a few of them are like in the high 60s right now.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I felt like just taking a peek through the box scores, seeing what happened. If you're, having a 76% save percentage or even high 60s, I felt like really important. And I think the goalie play, especially from McNaney, like that was the biggest kind of storyline of the weekend. And, his saves on Chris Kavanagh down the stretch, along with kind of just in that fourth quarter, sparking a lot of transition for them as well.
Yeah, I would say going off the discussion we had a couple of weeks ago, or like the norm of college lacrosse and like what we got used to, I would say that also probably trickles down to maybe more like second line middies, or not as old or mature as maybe what's been in the past. So like the depth of offenses is probably a little bit down. So I think that can probably be reflected in shooting percentage, and you take a one-off game and maybe there's some teams that aren't as good as we typically think they are. So like a 75% performance against X sounds really great, end of Feb. But when you look back at it, maybe later in the season, maybe that team just really wasn't as strong. But I mean, I do think there's a lot of good goalies, period. I was even really impressed with Gian Ficcaro against Princeton in the first half. He might have had like 8 to 10 saves in the first half with maybe 5 goals against his former team. So, guys are plucking good shots left and right now.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to gauge too. Is this a year of really good goalies? Is this a year of slightly down offensive production compared to, prior years? Are we just early in the season and I forget what it's like for shooting percentage, for the first 4 weeks of the season? It's just interesting, kind of a thing that pops out. I know, guys, we were trying to have Nate Kabiri on this week. Princeton Princeton star attackman after a big 2 games for them this past weekend. Those Ivy League guys have exams going on, so Nate was a bit busy this week. You guys want to dive into these games a little bit more here? Maybe impressions on the UNC, Penn, Princeton, Duke doubleheader weekend?
I think for Princeton, right, to walk away from this weekend 2-0 is just incredibly impressive. You're going down, winning the game against two really good ACC programs, good ACC teams. I think we're trying to figure out where Duke and UNC fit right now. I think Duke put up a pretty good fight, obviously, against Princeton, only a 1-goal loss. I think people walked away from this weekend respecting Duke even more than they did heading into the weekend. But I think, if you look ahead to tournament time, the fact that Princeton has already locked up these 2 wins along with their Penn State win, like they're sitting in a really good spot. I know that Ivy play gets really competitive, but Princeton, I think as good of a start as you could have really asked for.
Well, and you throw those 2 wins along with Harvard's win over Cuse. Feel like it's brewing for a big Ivy tournament, bracketology selection. But yeah, I mean, I think I was really impressed with Princeton's ball movement. I'm going to talk about that more in terms of the GPUs, but I thought the way that they were swinging the ball and really flowing in and out of different sets and different actions and moving Nate in a lot of different spots was definitely very similar to how Jim Mitchell put Sowers in a lot of different spots in that early 2020 season. So definitely impressive, from them. They've got some really good, like big defenders that they double team well. It clipped up a couple of nicely timed slides and disrupting guys in the bottom hand. So stuff that I think you'd appreciate as a D coordinator, Matt.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed. Unfortunately, I couldn't watch all these games live just with schedule, but I was going through the highlights and got to go through a lot of the replays of them, kind of watching them after the fact. One, I totally agree, Deemer. I know you're going to talk about Princeton's offense more in a little, so don't have to go too deep. I just thought the way they trigger things, the number of guys that are involved, their ability to kind of flow in and out of different actions was great. Kind of contrasts to UNC's a bit, where I felt like they ISO a bit more, see what that gets them, and then look to make plays off of that with their guys that they have that can play that way. I thought Princeton's defense was impressive just because you didn't know, not that Duffy or Dunn didn't have great games, but in the first half, at least, I think the first maybe 14 goals of the game, Princeton and UNC combined, were all different goal scorers, I believe is true. So just their ability to neutralize some of the big threats was interesting. Another team that I want to keep tracking is Colgate. I think they're a very interesting team right now. A lot of success so far this year, beating Loyola 18-6. Clearly are doing something right. I know they're a team that likes to play an unorthodox style of lacrosse, 10-man ride, turn things into a track meet. Maybe not your traditional ACC Big Ten in the box style of team with the most common 6-on-6 offense or defense, but a team that's definitely catching attention in the way they've been playing so far and winning some games.
I think it's interesting. I think Colgate, I need to dive into some more film on exactly what they're doing, but just the narrative, I think Colgate's doing a really good job, but the narrative right now is that Virginia stinks and Virginia beat Colgate 19-9. Right. So it's an interesting contrast. I think a lot of people have UVA outside of their top 20 now. Obviously, Colgate has rebounded really well, winning 4 straight after starting 0-2, but they are, having no trouble putting up big numbers.
Yeah, that's one that I definitely agree with you. Like I'm excited to just get my hands on more film of Colgate. I actually last week too put out a tweet because we had talked a few episodes back about the 10-man ride. And so that was something that I just kind of asked Twitter. I was like, hey, like what teams are running the best 10-man rides right now? And, I think it was BU and Colgate came up consistently. So, Coach Judd Lattimore, who was at Bucknell when we've talked about, the 10-man ride early season with Bucknell, having that influence on Colgate. They were causing a couple of weeks ago a lot of problems for Loyola with that and creating a lot of extra possession. So I think that's definitely been something that's been working in their favor.
One thing I've noticed talking to some players that I've coached that go to these schools and just over time of watching them is that it is, thinking about the Colgate Virginia game, there are kind of different levels to obviously, I think the conferences and the caliber of athlete maybe on average at the schools in each of these conferences. So I believe that you run a great 10-man ride, that might be super effective. in conference or against certain teams, but maybe you play a UVA and they have some athletes, some poles that can just, like the last few years, look at Cole Kastner, teams with 10-man, Virginia and Kastner would just run it by 3 guys and run it over the field. And if you have a guy that can do that, it kind of changes the game. So you might have like this great tactic that works really well in conference that maybe doesn't work against a UVA. Kind of just a higher level, a thought there, talking to some guys and watching some of the games.
Well, an early season too, right? So, teams just being more prepared for it and having more time to, everyone's different in terms of, we heard from AJ, about Maryland's prep and being prepared for every scenario early in the season. It's probably not that way everywhere in terms of what teams choose to focus on and what coaches believe is going to get them to their results in May. And so Virginia plays against 10-man ride every day in practice because they do so much of it, right? So they're definitely, your point about the athletes plus their just familiarity with that scheme. It's probably something that, if we were to go back and watch the tape, they probably handle that pretty well.
Well, it's a good point. It's also like the same. I'm thinking about that now with zone, right? A team that runs a zone defense is probably going to have a better zone offense because they go against zone defense in practice all the time. A team that runs a 10-man is probably going to clear better against a 10-man because they see it in practice all the time. A team that doesn't run zone defense, a team that never 10-mans, well, the first time they're seeing real 10-man that's not like some scout version that's hard to replicate is going to be in the game. All right, let's move on here just to make sure, before we get back to GPUs, back into some college action, we did carve out our players' perspective segment, moved it up forward. This week, we wanted to talk about recruiting, in particular, dive into uncommitted 26s, so juniors right now in season that aren't committed to playing college yet, and then we'll touch on 27s a bit too going into their summer. Deemer, off the start, I'm wondering, a junior in high school right now that wants to play college lacrosse, men's or women's, what advice would you give that player, that family, around things they can be doing in the process at this point? Because a lot of people think they missed the window, they feel behind because maybe if they want to go D1, friends have committed. Wondering what you would maybe say to that family, some advice you would give them.
Yeah. So I think this is a great time, for a player that's still not committed to reset and turn all their attention to the season. And it doesn't mean that we shut off some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in terms of things you can do during the season, but in terms of your focus, your passion, day to day, it's time to get back to focusing on your team, focusing on having the best junior season that you can have and really building from there and improving as a player. Something that, over the last few years, we've continued to talk about players not losing sight of that development process through this recruiting process. And so this is their opportunity to bring it back to that. Also, to just think about too, staying present in season and believing in the journey and staying in the moment is so crucial. Having fun with your teammates in some of the best times of your life, it's time to lean into that. I think that's something that can't be overstated. And we'll obviously, hear some of your guys' thoughts in terms of some of the technical things to also do. But that's where my mind goes first off.
Stephen, you had an interesting recruiting process that I know you've written about before in our Friday Weekly Thought. Do you want to share some light on your process and maybe how that might help some of these players at this point in their journey?
Yeah, so I was an uncommitted junior, with dreams of playing at the highest level. First and foremost, I'll acknowledge it's really tough, right? You see a lot of your peers, a lot of people that you're playing against, a lot of people you're seeing online, they're committed to these top programs. And it's like, wow, is there any room left at any of these places? Right. So I think one, you got to do your homework. You got to go and look, what do different rosters look like? What do, the commits look like? If you're a lefty attackman, do they have 2 lefty attackmen already committed in your class? Well, it might be time to move on from a program like that. So I think, first off, agreeing with everything that Deemer said, I think that's all really important. And then next steps, right? Do your homework on that. And then Dunn, we were just talking about it before we hopped on, right? As your season starts going, as you play more games, right? After each game, one thing that I would always do, I would then go back. We used Huddle at the time. I would use Huddle. I would cut up my clips and add them into, my highlight reel or my highlight tape for that time. 2 things get done there, right? You get to watch yourself back. You get to watch film on what you're doing. And 2, you get to add to your reel so that, when that season's over, or maybe even halfway through the season, you have new stuff to go and show college coaches that you can send in an email, right? No one needs to see the same thing over and over again. So it's nice to have that new tape, new film. And it's good to just stay on top of that the entire season. You never know when someone's going to reach out to you and say, hey, do you have any clips from your junior year? Like someone could respond to your email in April, right? And you want to have stuff there. So I think in terms of being ready, that's really important.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And Stephen, I was also an uncommitted junior. I committed in May of my junior year, and understanding times are different now. But last year, we had a senior I coached that we got committed to a D1 school in April, May of his senior year. And so just understand that's not super common, but it's not impossible. So understanding that everybody's journey is different. I think your point, Stephen, of finding the things in your control, clipping up your plays, getting things ready to go out. I also think finding ways to have conversations with your coach, your high school coach, maybe throughout the year, not every week, probably, but a couple of checkpoints, start some dialogue on, hey, here are my ambitions. One, am I crazy? Is this reasonable? Am I setting the right ambitions? Because not everybody gets to go to, Syracuse or Duke. It's just literally impossible. But so making sure that you're setting realistic goals and ambitions that your coach kind of can help you set, and then starting dialogue with them and hey, what can I do? Hey, have you heard anything? Because I hear from college coaches throughout the year that text me about guys, not everybody, some classes are more full than others, but there's a number of D1 schools that are still looking for 26s. There are all the D3s, all the like the NESCACs, they have their lists of players, but they can't offer anybody until July going into their senior year, really, once they get the pre-reads done. And so it really depends on where you want to go. But doing the things in your control. And I think one, clipping up all your plays like we talked about, two, starting dialogue with your coach. But Deemer, I think in the shuffle of that, the most important thing is committing to your team, because the better you are that year, the better team player you are, the more impact you have on your team, the more you develop, the more your coach is going to vouch for you, the more your coach will say, hey, Deemer Class, you got to look at this guy because he's doing everything our team needs from him. He's a great leader this year. He's really emerged, and you're going to show better on film because you'll play better. So you can't lose sight of the fundamental piece you're talking about.
That's a great point, because between high school and club coaches, by having a big junior spring and improving and doing all these things on and off the field, you're giving your advocates more ammo to go fight for you, and that's where it does fall back on the player. Like, give us more that we can go to a college coach and even more confidently say, hey, this is why this player is going to make an impact on your program. I think there's a little bit of a misconception out there that just because someone coaches you and is your club coach, that they're going to go to every school and say, hey, this player is a fit for your program. And it's really not how it works. A lot of, advocates are there to answer more questions from the college coaches, but they see what they see. And so if you show your advocates more, they can go take that information and then try to get that in front of more of the coaches. And that can be some of the information that gets you over the top or gets you back on that radar. So I think that's something that's really important to understand when it comes to thinking about that as well, because I do think people fall into that trap of, hey, I play for this team or I play for this club. So it means that, every person is having to go and say all these great things about me. Matt, you and I can both attest to our college recruiting experience being heavily impacted by Jack Crawford's very brutal honesty. Where when he said to college coaches that he thought you and I could fit and play at their level, that really meant something, because he had kept that credibility over years. He was not overselling people. He was not overhyping players. And that didn't always sit well with other families, if he didn't believe that. But that made a huge impact on our recruitment, because when he said it and he put that stamp, coaches believed it. And I know, again, Coach Caputo after the fact, really spoke to that, with Coach Jack. So I think that's something that, can't be overstated.
Yeah, Deemer, I think that's a great point about Coach Crawford's credibility. And I think as a coach, you want to be cognizant of that too. When families ask, hey, can you put in a word with this school? And can you talk to your contact here? And you can have those conversations. But I think important for families to understand, as well as coaches, that college coaches, like they kind of build their list of coaches they can trust and people they go to. If you're getting recruits over and over again from a school or a club coach, and those recruits aren't what the coach said they were, and you lose credibility, well, that pipeline is going to dry out. That's why I think you see some of these pipelines where, a bunch of kids from a certain school or club go to these colleges because the college coaches, recruiting's hard. They trust certain people to vet those players before them. They trust their word. They trust the way they develop them. So I think that's a great point, understanding for parents and the players that ask coaches for the sake of the program. You want that coach to be honest, even if it's not what you maybe want to hear. It's still it's long-term kind of what they need to do to maintain that credibility with the college coach.
Just one last point here, and I think it kind of sums up a lot of what we're saying, right? At the end of the day, persistence is going to win with this process. If you're a student athlete right now, if you're a junior in high school, right, it is up to you. It's not up to your parent. It's not up to your sibling. It's not up to your high school coach, your club coach, right? It's on you to continue to get better, take charge of your own process, right? And really figure it out for yourself as much as you can, right? Do your research on what's going on. Make sure that you're getting better in the backyard, outside of practice, that you're doing your best in games, right? That you're clipping up all your stuff. Take control of what you're doing, right? You still have time. You're only a junior in high school. I know the process has moved really fast, right? A lot of things can happen between your junior spring and your senior spring, right? And you have to be the one to make that happen, right? There's people that get lucky out there. Well, no one really gets lucky. They put themselves in a position where, something happens and then they move into that next spot. So take control of what you're doing, have persistence, right? And if you continue on that trajectory and you don't give up, good things are bound to happen.
It's also deciding what you want, right, Stephen? If a player just I want to get recruited and hope it happens. Well, what do you want out of a college experience, and how proactive are you? I have players that tell me they want to go play D1, and I'm like, okay, put together your list of things you want from a school and what you're doing for it. And then 2 weeks pass and they never get back to me. And I'm like, well, how bad do you want this? I gave you as an assignment work to do, and you're not taking ownership of it. And so I think understanding there is a piece. And I remember Deemer, our high school assistant coach, Tim Sullivan, told me, he was like, you have to sell yourself in the recruiting process. It's sales to a degree, and you can't sell something if the product's no good. But just because you're good doesn't mean you'll always get, recruited. It's hard. So you have to do your part in all of this and really drive the process.
There's always more you can do, and I think it is a very interesting balance. Like, I even think about with our athletes now and kids that we're training, it's always interesting, like hearing some kids come up after a session. Hey, what can I do to get better? And that's a start. You have some dialogue, and then you might have some back and forth with a player or a text or a call. But then it gets to a point where, as the coach, are you the one always driving and initiating the things to do versus putting it back in the player's court of, hey, I'm a resource for you. Your high school coach is a resource for you. Your club coach. How are you using your resources? How are you tapping into that? Whether it's recruiting, whether it's skill development. And I think sometimes players can get very used to everything coming from the coach, coming from mom and dad. And that's another part of this growth process where it can't always be that one direction. As coaches, it's our job too to reach out and build that connection as well. So we can't just sit here and say player's job to do all of it. I just think there's got to be a back and forth. And to your point now, specifically with the recruiting process, we've seen some players be really active in using us as a resource, and some just, we're always the ones reaching out. And that's where there's always more you can do.
I think just expand it. We don't have to go as long here, but expanding this advice beyond 26s, right? We talked a little bit specifically about players maybe in that recruiting period, but 27s are coming up into that window. I don't think the advice really changes. The one thing I would add to that was just, it's called the recruiting process for a reason. It is a dynamic process where you can prepare as much as you want now. You can think one thing going into it. Somebody might tell you you're going to hear these things, and it could totally change entirely. So the art of this, I think the lessons you get is how you navigate the process, deal with adversity, deal with uncertainty, learn how to navigate quick changes, not getting what you want, learn how to have those hard conversations, learn how to recalibrate over and over as one school's opinion changes on you, or maybe you have a better fall tournament, or maybe something, maybe you have maybe a recruiting class fills up somewhere you really want it to go. And so learning how to navigate that, I would say that's one thing I see where people are most disappointed when they get into the recruiting period is having unrealistic expectations and being tied to outcome, not tied to navigating the process in an appropriate manner, because very few people are like, I want to go to Syracuse, and they get to actually go to Syracuse. A lot of people want to go to Syracuse. Not everybody gets to go to Syracuse. So how do you navigate the process would be my advice of always focus on development, understand it's really dynamic, have these conversations, but prepare as much as you can. It's going to be uncertain throughout it.
Yeah, and with that, Matt, we're excited to launch in the next couple of weeks our recruiting course. It's going to be a $20 or $25 course. It's going to take families, players, parents through the whole process. Over 3 hours of content. There's probably 50 sections in it. Stay tuned and be on the lookout for it. We're pretty excited about just trying to take families through a lot of the basics and foundation for building the recruiting process and going through it, where if you're already in it, we think there's going to be a lot of good information. And so excited to launch that. And with that here, let's transition to GPUs for the week: games, players, and units. Matt, you want to kick us off?
Changing it up. Yeah, I got it. So games, players, and units. My game, I feel a little cheap doing this, but somebody had to do it. My game is Maryland Notre Dame. 11-10 Maryland over Notre Dame. In my opinion, just a great game across the board. And, we're kind of deeper into the season, but still pretty early. I thought it was just great lacrosse. And I thought Maryland played good offense, good defense. I thought Notre Dame showed how capable they are. Logan McNaney really, I think, is the reason Maryland won that game. 16 saves, 62%. But Maryland plays complementary lacrosse around Logan. Another interesting thing, kind of a theme starting to see more and more, is Notre Dame was 75% at the faceoff. And so you're just kind of seeing where a team really dominates the faceoff X, but it doesn't fully translate into the offensive output and the scoreboard at the end of the game. I mean, I think Logan McNaney had a lot to do with that. And I thought Maryland was pretty efficient with their possessions. And we've talked before about how Coach Tillman does a good job with the offense and really taking great, not good shots. And I think we saw that a bit in the game of Maryland's patience and poise. And I think a positive from that game, from Maryland's perspective, is that's a big game. Maryland lost in the championship to Notre Dame last year. Coach Tillis did a great job of them making it not about this bigger thing than it was. It was just about playing that game, being in the moment, falling back on their training. And I thought Maryland did that. I'm sure Notre Dame's sitting there like, oh, we hit Logan in the foot, we hit pipes, like this, that, the other. So just overall great game, fun to watch. Both of those teams, I think, are incredible and going to have a great year. My player, Hunter Chauvette, 5 goals against Virginia, 56% shooting. Fun player to watch. He was scoreless in the past 2 games, which I didn't realize. So just, a guy like him being able to step back into that role, score goals in a 1-goal win over UVA, which is a big win for Hopkins, and just a highlight worthy guy where I just think most of his goals are pretty fun to watch and impressive. My unit is Cornell's attack. So Cornell played Richmond on Sunday. Richmond went up early. I think this is a very talented Richmond team. Cornell ends up winning by 1. Obviously, Cornell's attack is, highlighted coming into the season with Kirsch, Goldstein, and Long. Kirsch went 3-1, 4 points. Goldstein 2-2, 4 points. Michael Long 2-0. But more impressively than that, they kind of put Cornell on their back down the stretch. So Cornell is down 9-11. Cornell won 12-11. So the last, 4 goals were Kirsch assisting Long. The 10th goal was Kirsch unassisted with his right hand. The 11th goal was Kelleher, a midfielder, off a rebound. And the 12th goal was Long unassisted to his left hand. So kind of seeing down the stretch that unit being able to score unassisted goals so that we can and kind of assist each other. So just a unit that I think everybody talked about coming into the year. Kind of hard to pick this week, but a team that against a tough Richmond team on a Sunday game on the road was able to put the team on their back down the stretch and get a win there.
One thing I think going off that, and then I'll kick it to Steve, I'm kind of feeling like this could be the year of the lefty scorer. You got a couple of guys. You got Heltz, Kirsch, Mackesy. You got Chauvette. I'll talk about Amon. A lot of guys that are filling up the back of the net and are definitely fun to watch. Steve, talk about your GPUs.
So my game, Princeton men, 14-12 win over UNC. That was a Sunday morning game at 11. I thought it got off to a little bit of a slow start after both teams playing on Friday, but ultimately was a great game and was really close until the end. Nice to see Chad Palumbo come through in the end. He finished really strong, and you just highlighted Coulter Mackesy. He just continues to be incredibly impressive from a skill perspective, but also from a leadership and quarterback type perspective from that lefty wing. From a player perspective, someone that stood out, Will Schaller from Maryland. In 2 full games that I've watched him play, he's been guarding both Spallina and Chris Kavanagh. I've just been incredibly impressed with, the way that he plays the game. He had a highlight reel, diving save that he somehow stopped with his stick against Notre Dame. But he's someone that has definitely stood out. And I think both Spallina and Chris Cav, they've had good games. They've been able to get their own. But I think Schaller has done a lot of things, in between the lines as well. He had a nice run out at the end of the game. He's a guy that's really impressed, and I think will definitely be a teamer All-American. And then unit. I just wrote BC woman here. I don't know if it's, a credit to their offense or really just their whole team, but through 7 games, they only have 63 turnovers, averaging 9 per game. That leads the country in fewest turnovers per game. It's no secret that BC, is the team to beat right now. They're the number 1 ranked team. They won the national championship last year. The more you take care of the ball, the less opportunities that the other team gets to win. So that really stood out to me, and, interested to continue watching them play and see how that develops.
And Steve, that's 63 turnovers. That's as a team.
Yes, from a team perspective.
I think that's even more impressive too when you factor in the clear, and really the field is a little bigger too. So it just shows their discipline, and it's a great stat. All right, finishing off my GPUs here. Game, I had JMU Florida. JMU avenging last year's conference championship loss. 17-16 thriller. Maddie Epke, 4 goals on 5 shots, 2 assists, and 18 draw controls. And for our men's lacrosse fans that are, listening and maybe don't watch as much of the women's game, to have that many draw controls, whether you're the draw taker or you're playing on the circle, that simply means that you're the one coming up with the ball. And so when you compare that to the men's game, and, not always are these face-off guys winning the ball to themselves, you're using a lot of wing play and stuff. That's just a really high number and really impressive from Epke. Also, we talked about this earlier, but shout out our girl, Franny Hahn, coached her at St. Paul's, 10 points, really stepping up, starting an attack as a redshirt freshman for Florida. Player, I have 2 from Penn State. Jack Amon and Kyle Lehman. Amon 3 goals, Lehman 5 goals. Lefty shooters, goal scorers, guys that have been fun to watch. Amon the week before too had 3 goals on man up, low to low, low to high. He can really shoot it. That's been a big transfer for Penn State. So a couple guys that I thought stood out there in a big win against Yale. And then unit Princeton offense. I really enjoyed, clipping up and watching the Princeton offense play. They swing the ball well. They move in and out of different spots. Their offense is very amoeba-like. It's constantly changing. There was one screenshot I had where you had 6 guys down the middle of the field within the edges of the crease. Like if you took that from end line to midline, like they're changing shapes. They're moving really well. They've got a lot of nice triggers and actions. So excited to see how that offense continues to flow, and a lot of talented lefties and righties to balance out the unit.
Some people probably have a grip on this, but a lot of people are probably curious. An offense like Princeton's, you say triggers and actions, amoeba-like. How do you cultivate an offense that can play that way? What is a trigger and an action? What do you do after the triggers and actions? How do you use principles? What do you think maybe are some keys and some drivers of the way Princeton plays offense?
Yeah, I think first off, it certainly starts with recruiting. You need skilled players, you need guys that can win matchups, but you also need guys that have great sticks. I think how they've continued to grow too takes unselfish guys, guys that don't need to have the ball in their stick. They have it in their stick for longer. Like if, Makasee or Kabiri is carrying for longer and working their dodge, like they're comfortable with that, but they also know the balance of when to swing it and get it out of their stick. So I think that unselfish team mindset is something that they really probably have to cultivate from day one every year with a new group of guys. And that definitely ties back to upperclassmen leadership. In terms of, triggers and actions, you're essentially, in terms of triggers, you have some different starting looks, like different picks, or, someone starting a dodge and then swinging the ball to the other side, like some simple things that you can use to trigger the beginning of your offense. But then the direction that it goes after that can be very free flowing. So instead of trying to script all the way through to a shot, they're maybe just talking about things that they like to start the set. Hey, we want to get a big little razor pick with this guy, or, hey, we're seeing the defense play this way. Let's start with pass down, pick down on the wing and explore a flyby. But if nothing's there, like pick it and then start it. And I think they've built the chemistry, Burns and Kabiri starting as freshmen last year, and Mackesy rising as an upperclassman. They're building that chemistry to where they can do that on the fly so quickly. And we actually saw like Burns scored a goal and then the whole attack unit ran over to get on the iPad with Mitchell as the faceoff guys were subbing, just to probably show them a simple wrinkle or a thing to look out for before they, get into their next offensive set. So I think that's how it goes. And then again, you're just going to see a lot of different shapes and starting looks, and then their guys are going to be free to make plays.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just think it's so interesting now watching some of these offenses play. A lot of people like myself at times are wondering how much of that is scripted, how much of that is trigger versus principles of play and chemistry they've developed. And Coach Mitchell says, this game, like we think we can drift this more than clear through because of the way they play it, or we know they like to slide off this clear through so we can kind of tease it and pop behind it. It's just interesting. And the Princeton offense is fun to watch. And I think one of the prime examples of what we've talked about in the modern lacrosse of positionless offense, guys moving to different spots of the field, really challenging defenses.
Matt, I would just add, just because I just found it interesting. Like, I don't know if it's something that right now is worth a breakdown, but I'll just mention it here on the podcast. One example of it specifically, if you had, they had Mackesy out on the wing or a Dodger, they had a guy top center, and they had a guy, top outside the box on the ball side, like kind of where Mackesy was. That guy on the kind of high corner, he passed down and then he flybys. So they had that look as an option, but right as that's happening, the top middle guy is sprinting over to then pick on ball. So instead of just the typical two-man like pass and pick or pass and flyby, that first action happens while the top middle guy is then running over, if it's not there, to then pick. And so now it involves that third guy, and then the defender covering the top middle guy, he's just like, oh crap, like I got to get over there and now cover a pick. I was watching the other two-man action happen. So it's just very subtle, nothing like shattering, but like it's different than what you typically see when it comes to people playing pairs.
Yeah, and I think if you break that down, like generally it's off-ball offense. The more you can occupy your man, the better, because as a defense, you want to be able to handle multiple responsibilities. So as an off-ball defender, you have a great team has multiple responsibilities off the ball. I have my man or the player I'm guarding. I have a player I have to support to. Either I'm a two or I'm about to roll into a play, or I'm communicating a pick, or I'm the hot player supposed to slide to the ball. So if you can fully occupy your player off the ball to take them out of being able to occupy multiple roles, then now all of a sudden there's going to be a missed slide. There's going to be a missed assignment. There's going to be a miscommunication. And so I think when you look at the best defenders, it's really hard to fully occupy them because they have great stance. They have great head turns. They're able to process the game and see the game well. And so as a younger player, understanding when coach is teaching stance, teaching head turns, talking about seeing more than one, it's easy if everybody's standing still. It gets really hard. Like when you look at top D1 programs and how fast they play, if you aren't excellent at processing the game and having multiple roles, well, you're going to get exploited by some of these offenses that can fly by and pick at the same time. And in the middle of a dodge, when you're hot, they also do a backside exchange where, Notre Dame vacates the crease really well, right? And so if you watch the Maryland Notre Dame game, they get a few goals because they occupy Maryland slide guy, and they turn the corner and there's no slide because they did a great backside exchange and occupied those guys. So I think it's a great, what Princeton does well is all those actions, they're occupying players, taking up their ability to do multiple roles. Before we move on to hot topics, just want to give a quick shout out to Stephen for selecting a Maryland defender for his player of the week. So round of applause for Stephen for branching out there.
Hey, yes.
All right, hot topics. One we had, which I think is interesting. Deemer, I know you kind of tweeted about finishing on the back pipe, wanting to finish in the ground, but we also talked a little bit about the Chris Kavanagh between the leg shot, because it's something that if it goes in, it's great and becomes a personality. So you have a player that's talented like Chris Kavanagh. How much as a program, as a coach, do you limit that to be more fundamental and efficient versus letting those players lean into their strengths, which might mean live and die by the sword a little bit? I'm curious your guys' thought. Maybe Stephen, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that play. or philosophically, are you okay with that between the leg shot at that point? Would you want to see something different?
Yeah. So, I think it has caused a lot of discussion. And obviously, people come out of the woodwork on Twitter and wherever else. Like, I can't believe he shot that between the legs, et cetera. I think if you take a look at Chris Kavanagh and what he's done, right? He's a senior. He's won 2 national championships. He's incredibly impressive everywhere. He's got the green light to do just about anything he wants. If you look at that game specifically, he was trying to put the team on his back, the offense on his back in that fourth quarter to do any single thing he could to help them win that game. I think he finished with 4 goals on 14 shots, and his energy and hustle, it was just incredible. I mean, that one goal he scored where he's like diving, fading to X, I've never even seen someone really score like that. So, I think just incredibly impressive there. Does he probably wish he maybe waited another second shooting that shot? Sure, but he can't see who's behind him. And I also think the ball slipped out of his stick a little bit and bounced higher than he wanted it to. I think he more so wanted to go 5-hole. McNaney did a good job, but I think that ball went higher than he wanted it to. So I don't really have a huge problem with it. And also, if you take a look, I know Carcaterra, I don't know if it was last spring or the spring before, did a little shoot around with both Pat Cav and Chris Cav. The two of them are just doing those shots all the time on their own. It's similar to, we had Gary Gate on our podcast this fall, and I know, he's a proponent. And if you look at his teams, right, they play more of that style, free flowing. And I think Notre Dame has a really good balance of it. But he was saying, if someone's practicing it all the time on their own, then they're practicing it in practice, doing it in a game, then that's all right. But, if it's the first time you ever did it, yeah, why are you doing that? But with someone like Chris Kavanagh, that's not the first time that he's done that. So I don't hate it personally.
I'd echo a lot of that. And I would say it's definitely a live or die. They've just come off 2 championships, and it's probably a lot of the same stuff that Pat, Jake Taylor, and Chris have been doing over the last 3 years. So why are you going to change it up now? I think it's a really slippery slope if you start yelling at a player for finishing like that when probably they've scored multiple highlight reel goals like this over the last couple of years. It just, it's a shot that he wants back on the crease in the doorstep. I think the other interesting point is then take the last shot of the game where he catches lefty, very fundamental. He turns, he fakes, he finishes off the foot of McNaney. You couldn't really have him do anything else better as a fundamental finisher, right, in that situation. And it was still saved. It was a great save, and that's where you have to tip your cap. And so I think that's even more fascinating. It's not just one shot. It was 2 shots on the doorstep that were saved, both the opposite ends of the spectrum of fundamental versus what, is maybe fundamental now, but people don't consider it fundamental. And so it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition, I think. And I don't think you can really fault him for that when that's just the style that they've been playing.
I think the most important thing that you said there is that you got to be consistent as a coach. And I think this is where coaching comes into it. You have to decide, there's not always a right or wrong, right? Because there's a ton of benefits to giving guys like the Kavanaghs the green light to play the way they do, but you want to be consistent. You can't rip a guy for missing a shot like that when that's what you've built your success on for a long time. And I'm not saying Coach Corrigan did that. I have no clue. I doubt he did, honestly. But as a coach, I think it's your job to decide as a program to be consistent. What do you believe in? If you believe that that's not a great shot, then you consistently hold guys accountable to it. And maybe you kind of talk about how some of that's fool's gold when it goes in sometimes. And then when you turn the corner to your offhand and get saved, you say, hey, look, you did it the way we asked you to. You got to tip your cap to Logan there. And now you're consistent in just how you approach it. And I think I've gotten that advice before from coaches. It's like, hey, I don't know if what I say, there's other ways to do this. There's other ways to, you see, it's not right or wrong, but I want to have clear expectations for my guys. So I'm not mad at them when it doesn't go in and happy when it does, because that's confusing. That's about outcome and not about process. And so I can't sit here and say whether or not the Kavanagh shot is right or wrong. It's the way they've done things. And if it goes in, it's a great play, and I think what I'm used to and accustomed to is if you watch Maryland play, it's just, that's not the way Coach Tillman is. He's very move through the ball, because maybe it goes in 6 out of 10 times between the legs, but it goes out of 7 or 8 out of 10 times if you move through the ball, turn the corner, see the goalie, and get the chance to pump and fake it, And so it's just a different philosophy based off who you are and what you believe in and what you want to focus on with your players.
And that brings up too, I would say that's the difference between Steve, like your guys' offensive culture at Cuse, and what we had as like our offensive culture at Duke was more similar to what you're saying, Matt. Like turn the corner, finish in front, put it in the dirt. Those are like staples of Duke, and guys like Jordan Wolf and, people like really bought into that over the years. So it's 100% where, and this might throw some people for a loop, is where the consistency is not going to be the same, Matt, is different guys on the offensive unit. Corrigan is not going to yell at Chris Kavanagh in that situation the same way that he might yell at the second line midfielder. And that's just a hard reality that people are going to have to understand. It's the same thing with like dropping your hands, like some guys earn that leash and earn that license to do it. And then the coach has to live or die by it. But you better believe if, second line midi gets in there and he's on the doorstep and he throws it between his legs, like maybe if it's not Cuse, if it's not Albany, everyone else, that kid is getting absolutely ripped by coach. If it's Chris Cav, if it's CJ Kirst, if it's, Mackesy, like one of these top alpha guys, like you better believe that they have some more room and license to take those chances.
Yeah, and that's something I think you're spot on, and I don't think people should have a problem with that, right? It's a fact of the game. It's a fact of different teams. I think coaches need to hold everyone accountable to the same standards when it comes to effort, commitment, hustle, energy, stuff like that. Sure, you can hold everyone there, right? But Chris Kavanagh is not the same player as a second line midfielder or even the third guy on their first line midfield, right? He's just not, and he's proven that time and time again. So, and it comes back to that preparation. You're talking like between Syracuse and Duke, definitely contrasting styles, right? But it's also like, what does the practice look like? Does Duke have practice where, they're saying overhand shots, into the dirt, stuff like this, really fundamental, like that stuff you're working on. Syracuse isn't working on necessarily behind the backs, but guys are working on it the whole time. Like Joey Spalina, Finn Thompson, Owen Hill. It's like those guys, that's just a part of their game, a part of who they are. So it's the same thing I was saying before, that transitions to the game when that's just a part of who you are, a part of your game. So ultimately, I think saying the same thing, but an interesting topic, and it definitely varies program to program, coach to coach.
It's the same defensively. Like you will not see, like I will pay you guys $10 each if Maryland throws an over the head check this year as a close defense. Like I just don't think you'll see it. When we went over the head in practice whistle blew on the end line. Like, and I don't know if it's changed, but that's just like the way it was. And it's not that you can't get an over the head check, but coach tells us like, hey, if we start throwing them, you might get one or two, but we might get beat for no reason because of it. It's just not what we're going to choose to do. And so, but you see other programs like Virginia will do that.
And I think, you're talking about like Maryland's such a different style than different places. I think if you look at a Notre Dame, like I think Corrigan and his staff have done such a good job of balancing the two, like between being really disciplined, but also letting their guys play, right? You look at some of their guys in the past, I feel like Kavanagh was their first, like Matt Kavanagh, the oldest one, was their first like lefty slasher, slick type player. Guys like Ryder Garnsey, he's definitely a lot different from Corrigan, but now he's on staff with Corrigan, right? And I think it's really balanced them out and has now led to them having some of the best offensive talent while also maintaining like that really strict discipline and playing really hard and really well in a lot of other areas as well.
It kind of brings to the point I made over Twitter where you can have that style, but then there are situations where you're just like, this is a fundamental truth that we believe, and we're going to put our foot in the ground, And so that's where I was kind of inspired to think about that back pipe finish where, again, the clip was Wisnauskas getting saved, high to high on the inside quick stick. But my point wasn't to call out Logan. My point was broadly that if you guys can both remember Scotty Rogers when he was playing for the Machine in the MLL All-Star game, makes that crazy pipe-to-pipe save one hand. Now, I saw that in TAF practice last week. Like kids are making that save now because goalies are becoming more athletic and flexible, and they're throwing their bodies pipe to pipe. And time again, the shot that I see give goalies a chance to get saved on that look is the quick stick that goes hips or high, because that's where goalies are naturally throwing their stick like across the center of the cage. And so to me, that was where in that situation, I'm like, hey, I'm not going to tell you exactly where to shoot, but if you get that cross crease, like you just catch, snap it down the goal line, I think you're scoring that 9 or 10 out of 10 times versus to the point of, 7 or 8, or just giving that goalie that highlight reel opportunity. I think you close the door on opportunities like that.
Yeah, I think you're completely spot on. And speaking from experience on that backside pipe, I have had my handful of moments of getting stuffed when I put that ball high versus you catch it on the backside. I would throw it into the ground every single time. You're exactly right.
Yeah, not to get too general or vague here, but there's a quote that I think it's Jocko Willink, if you guys know who he is, and maybe it's not his original quote, but it's like discipline is freedom. And so when you have great discipline around certain things within that structure of discipline, you can play free. So it's like you decide kind of where where your guardrails are, and like here are the things we absolutely do and don't do, but within that, and might be unique to each guy, explore and be free. So maybe it's like, you have certain rules, certain ways you play, you pass, and you have to do this, like occupy your man off the ball, use your outside hand, play with speed, get your stick to the middle, whatever. But within that, be creative. I do also think that's the hard part of coaching, because you want to you want to let players play to their strengths. You don't want to put the leash on them and hold them back from their strengths, but you also want to not let guys just shoot around the world all the time and all of a sudden all your shots are all over the place.
It's a hard balance for sure, and it's definitely a great topic. And I think also when you kind of tie it back to offensive coaches too, you'll hear everyone say, hey, we run a free flowing pairs like motion offense, but then it's very scripted and there's a ton of freaking rules. So you can like do the same thing. Hey, we want to let our guys be, creative within the discipline, but then there's a list of 15 things that you kind of can't do. And then how much actually room is there to be creative, So that I agree with Steve, your point about Corrigan and staff like really seeming to do a good job of that, because you're seeing that balance play out and allow them to unlock offenses the last couple of years that haven't been the case, back, a decade ago, that they weren't scoring. I mean, it's again, shot clock era. There's a lot of evolutions, but they're more, known for their offensive talent than they were. And that's probably a big part of it.
One topic I want to touch on quickly, we don't have to go super deep and we might hit it more throughout the season, is the invert, just because we're seeing every team you watch at any game, they're inverting. They're big littling, they're single inverting. We're even seeing teams bring 3 players behind the cage. And I just think there's logical reasons to do it, but you're seeing teams get smart with how they do it. I find it really interesting how teams defend the invert now. Do they get into a package? Do they kind of stay in their base defense? Are they sliding fast and flushing it? Are they sliding adjacent off the wing? And so there's a lot of different ways to do it. I think an interesting one was UVA versus Hopkins. And Hopkins plays, I wouldn't say they get into a package. I guess it's kind of hybrid where they get into a shape and they drop a hot guy to slide. But Hopkins slides fast. So they, behind the ball, when they get inverted, their short stick almost plays the ball to get beat and to play in the trail and like force guys to tuck their stick, and they slide. If you watch UVA to the point of like free flowing, we're scripted. My gut says all we can practice. UVA scripted their offense to exploit Hopkins' quick sliding defense. And they got a few looks off of it where they dodge, draw the slide, roll off the crease, throw it back, and then they get them rotating and they're skipping it through the defense for shots. So from your two's perspective, wondering, any quick thoughts on, as an offense, we're talking about triggers and putting guys in different spots of the field. Why might you invert? Why might you big little versus single? Why might you bring a third guy behind the cage? When would you consider using the invert more as an offense?
Yeah, I'll kick it off. I'll say in general why I think inverts are great is because it's really the one time where you can get teams to turn their heads. If you keep everything above goal line, the goalie and the defense can kind of see everything in front of them. And so just the basic philosophy of the invert, I think, is really effective, because now you got to get the goalie turned, or they're kind of having that stance where they're looking over their shoulder over the pipe, and then defense is constantly having to keep head on a swivel and figure out that zone up top. And then from a offensive standpoint, again, like you're either bringing a second, in some cases now we've seen like a third guy below, that's allowing for less defenders and more space up top, just depending on how the defense is, getting into their package and how they want to support it. I think you're bringing short sticks that are, again, like just simply, I know it's not this new trend, but you're bringing short sticks that are maybe getting less time covering inverts, below goal line and getting them into different spots versus always driving against the pole coming from goal line. And so I think those are some of the benefits that you're getting. And Steve, I'd love to hear your perspective on playing back there. And you had a really nice opportunity in your career to go from being an attackman to a midfielder with the Cannons and then get a lot of inverts right away.
Look, I think from, it's interesting topic for right now. I think from an ex-attackman's perspective, the invert can be great because it brings someone else back there with you. And, if you want to make that into a two-man, I'll talk about UNC Princeton here. UNC was going into an invert, like kind of in and out of it. And I thought if you look at it might be their first or second possession of the fourth quarter, they invert. Duffy goes back there and sets the pick. So it's like a two-man back there. Duffy's defender ends up getting above the cage as the dodge takes place. And as they break above GLE, the inverting midfielder throws it back to him. And now Duffy has the chance. He is able to dodge on a defender that's now trying to chase him around the pipe, and they score off of it right away. They never ended up really going back to it where they looked for that throwback look. But I just think from being back there, I was surprised that they didn't go more to it because Duffy, if he has someone running out at him, like he's almost able to be all those guys. So I think, it's really beneficial for that ex-attackman if you bring someone else back there because it throws off, I like the hang up game a lot. I think Syracuse uses it a ton. I used it a ton when I was there. Spillane is masterful at it, right? It just creates a lot of issues for the defense from both a dodging and feeding perspective. And then, Deemer, you talk about, I had the chance to invert as a midfielder in the PLL. I think the defense, you can always hear it, right? As you carry back there. Now the defense is communicating a ton, almost all yelling at each other. Like, what are we doing? What's the move here? Like, who's going, right? It just causes so many issues. And the more that you can, figure out what's your strength back there, right? Do I pick a side and do I dodge hard? Is it a solo invert, a double invert? Are we changing directions back there? I just think there's a lot of different wrinkles you can do out of it, right? The single invert, double, even triple, which we saw Villanova, you highlighted earlier in the year. I think it just causes headaches. It flips the field a little bit. And, I think we also talked about, I think last week, if you're a midfielder, if you can invert, you're probably going to find your way onto the field, which is important if you can, play above and below.
Yeah, the invert is challenging to cover. There's different ways to do it. But I think one of the reasons you guys mentioned is now you have a guy, you've taken a guy out of place, a short stick behind the cage where it's a matchup you might not love. So you have to be ready to slide. But now you have if it's single invert, you have all 5 offensive players above the cage. 1 or 2 of which are going to cut hard into a really dangerous area. One of which is going to mirror to the back pipe, which is the easiest look for the invert guy to make. And now you have 2 or 3 guys floating for shots, step down shots above the cage. So you need to have a guy ready to support. You need to get to the back pipe. You need to cover ball side cutters, and you need to have sticks and lanes so that the through balls don't get through. And if the cuts are really effective, well, now you probably lose a slide guy because you got occupied, or you crack that. I say those cutters that have gravity, they cut and the whole defense crashes on them because they cut so well, drop over the top. And so a team that can invert well, it is a different look where maybe in a normal above the cage offense, one guy's behind the cage and they're out of the play. So you have a free plug or a free show or a free help. And I just think if nothing else, it's a whole another challenging element for a defender to get good at, a team defense to practice. So I like, as an offense, I love having it in there and changing it up between big, little, and maybe a third guy behind and single, at razor and directly at X and all of that, because a defense now gets stressed to handle those things.
Yeah, going off that, Matt, one, and I don't know if there's a name for it. If someone has a name, like comment and send it in, but I feel like I heard someone refer to it as a merry-go-round, but the wing dodge that turns into the quick invert. And I love it because it's a really nice counter. You've seen Maryland do it a lot. You see teams, Yale, anyone that plays like that fade game at X, when teams are deciding to, cut off that X outlet, the X attackman gets out of there on the wing dodge. And now you go from a true dodge on the wing to then quick single invert at X. And that midi just carries through. And what I also love about it is when you get into a really obvious invert and the guy just carries down the side and gets below goal line, typically the dodge happens a lot farther away from the goal because the defense is able to crowd space and approach out on the ball and push the offense to make their move farther from goal line. When you get that merry-go-round look and you carry your wing dodge right into the invert, you see a lot of D middies having to straddle the back of the cage because the dodge is happening a yard or two from the back of the crease. And now that's where hesitation to then change a direction or hesitation to turn the corner and go or, finalizer type moves. That's really hard, I think, as a short stick to cover because you don't have your stick to help you. You're playing the guy straight up at X and he can really go either way. So I think that's a really effective way to get into the invert that we just see a lot of.
We would call it, yeah, I know at least when I was at Maryland, that was merry-go-round. I don't know if they still call it that, but it is hard because you're not able to set up in your package if you want to as quickly because the first dodge actually threatens the goal. It allows now the X guy doesn't need to be an outlet anymore, so he can back cut if the X defender's showing, he can back cut him with no consequence because the dodge is just going to carry the X now. And so I do think Maryland does that well, and other teams do too. It does put some pressure on that pipe area. Guys, just because we've been going for a little, we can always come back to the invert in future episodes as we keep seeing it this year. Stephen, do you want to look ahead here, talk about some notable games coming up this weekend?
Yeah, some great games this weekend. Probably the highlight or top 10 matchup, Penn State at Cornell. That is on at noon on Saturday. Big matchup there. Penn State has won the last two. They won 20-9 last year and then 10-6 in 2023. So I'm excited for that one. I think Penn State is legit. Like I said earlier, their only loss is that 1-goal overtime loss to Princeton, which they showed a lot of fight in. I think they were down 3 goals at a couple different times. Really respect Coach Tambroni and what he's done there. And then Cornell, Tambroni's back at Cornell, where he was once a coach. I think Busick and their young staff, they do a phenomenal job. We highlighted their offense. Just excited to see that one. Then Ohio State at Notre Dame. That's 2 p.m. Saturday on the ACC network. Ohio State, they have 6 straight wins since that season opening loss to Utah. Most notably, they took it to UVA. So interested to see, what level are they at? Is this a contender? Is this a team that's still trying to find its identity? And then Notre Dame just coming off the loss. As we highlighted, I think Chris Kavanagh's class, that might have been their 8th career loss that they just had in total. So look for them. They're not going to want to drop back-to-back losses. And then 2 other games stand out. Rutgers at Princeton Saturday night at 7 p.m. Princeton obviously on fire right now. Rutgers, I don't think having the season that they want to, but this is always, a pretty interesting and good rivalry between the two, in-state game. Feels like there's always an upset or two. I think a lot of those years when Princeton would somehow miss the tournament at the end, like this Rutgers game usually came back to haunt them later on. So I'm just excited to see what that one can look like. And I like that the games are also spaced out. We got a 7 p.m. game. And then big game on Sunday, Hopkins at Syracuse, 2 p.m. That's going to be on ESPNU. 2 blue bloods, 2 programs that are still, trying to crack back into that Final Four. This has been a great game the past couple of years. So excited for that one.
Yeah, I'm really eager to see the Ohio State Notre Dame game. And I feel like that's a game that Notre Dame has the last couple of years really taken. Last year, what sticks out, I believe there was a 3-minute non-releasable, if I'm thinking about the right game, where I think Notre Dame might have torched for like 3-man up goals, like back to back to back. And unless that was 2 years ago. So I'd like to see, again, like Ohio State obviously beating UVA. We know that UVA is not the team that they were right now, at least. And some of their, other wins have been good, but they're not, top 2 teams in the country. So I think that's going to be a real barometer for them and also a barometer for how the Big Ten is going to compare to the ACC. Obviously, we saw the great game last weekend, and I'm definitely excited for Hopkins Cuse. I think as kind of had that stretch of time where Hopkins wasn't competing like they were in the past, kind of forget how their schedule has always been geared towards big game, big game, big game. They're on ESPNU like every week, it feels like. And so I feel like if you're a Hopkins fan, you're pretty pumped that now like every game your team's playing is this really relevant top 10 matchup, so it's definitely cool to see for them.
I remember for whatever reason, Notre Dame, I believe Deemer 2015 or 2016, Notre Dame won 9-0.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's not the last shutout in like a game like that, but one of the last shutouts I recall in a semi big game. Interesting matchup there. Bobby Van Buren and Chris Kavanagh. I think that will be a fun one. Bobby's obviously great defender guy. We know Chris Kavanagh's Orton candidate. So great matchup there. And Hopkins Cuse, just one of the most classic regular season and postseason games you'll get. The last few years, it's been a fun one to watch. So definitely excited to see the slate of games coming up this weekend.
That game was March 21st, 2015, 9-0 Notre Dame over Ohio State. Nick Osella had 3 goals that game. And then a Baltimore product, I've never even talked to you guys about him, Connor Doyle, was 2-1.
Connor was my neighbor growing up. Great athlete. Connor was my matchup when we would play Notre Dame. And so he was like, knew him when I was like 8 years old, would play Notre Dame. We played him 3 times my sophomore year. Regular season, ACC tournament, playoffs, covered him all 3. And that was when, Gordon Murray was covering Matt Kavanagh for us. And those games were like 6-5 typically, but Connor was very good player.
He was legit in high school too. But I would say, Matt, that was probably a matchup that helped you get recruited.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, covering him, going to Notre Dame. I remember we played Gilman and I slashed him in the face the first 1 minute of the game because I was so amped up and got a penalty and then kind of settled in. It was those memories you have from a high school game, those really core ones. It was a Tuesday afternoon after school, ground ball comes over the midline. I just whack him right in the face mask and get a flag.
We probably could have tied in some of that to the 2026 discussion for Uncommitted as a junior. Matt had a great run covering some top D1 commits and kept putting himself on the map. But yeah, and then look, Penn State Cornell. Cornell, I'm excited for that because obviously their attack's been hot, but Penn State's got a really good D and a hot goalie. So, and Cornell's got that revenge factor coming in here. So I'm definitely eager for that game. I think that's going to be a really good battle.
Yeah, I'm pretty high on Penn State. I kind of always like the way they go about their business. I think they're big, strong athletes, but they're also pretty skilled. Matt Trainor's a guy, interested to see what he looks like this weekend. He only had 1 assist against Yale, but in all his other 4 games, he's been putting up some monster points. So excited to see, how he attacks this Cornell defense.
Awesome. Deemer, want to bring us home?
Yeah, guys, great episode. I'm excited for the weekend. I think there's a lot to look forward to. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. If you have feedback or thoughts, please share. We're trying to keep improving every week as we keep getting in the flow of the season. We're heading into March, which is crazy to say. Games have been going on for 4 or 5 weeks now. So it's exciting, but a lot of lacrosse ahead, March, April, May coming up. And, follow along on our socials. We're adding a lot of weekend coverage and highlights. And then stay tuned for new editions of our Friday Weekly Thought and our Sunday Coaches Corner. We have a new edition coming out, our free newsletters. Stay tuned there. And guys, great catching up today.
Great stuff. See you guys.